Hello everyone, welcome to Physio TV once again. Today we start with the second part of the stroke rehab series. We have with us Dr. Ivy and Sebastian, who will talk about pathophysiology of stroke, what difference does it make in rehabilitation. For today, we have our panelist, Dr. Radha Bhattar, who is a professor and HOD of neurology, neurophysiotherapy at Sancheti College of Physiotherapy in Pune. Hello. Today we have with us Dr. Ivy Sebastian. She is a consultant at Department of Neurology at St. Stephen's Hospital, Delhi. She had worked with WHO for various projects and research studies for the stroke rehabilitation. She is a World Stroke Organization Future Stroke Reader. Today she'll talk about pathophysiology of stroke. What difference does it make in rehabilitation? Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Radha. Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Ivy Sebastian, and today I will be speaking to you about the pathophysiology of stroke and what difference does it make in rehabilitation. So in the next 30 to 40 minutes, I will cover about the different types and subtypes of stroke, the pathophysiology of the different types of stroke and the underlying mechanisms. And lastly, what rehabilitation considerations need to be made depending upon the above. So we will start with the case scenario. This is about a 55-year-old lady who presented with complaints of sudden onset left face, arm, and leg weakness, which was noted around 6 hours prior to presentation. Among risk factors, she's a known hypertensive and a diabetic. On examination, she had a left hemiparesis, left facial palsy, and dysarthria. So in this case scenario, what do you think the patient has? So since it is a sudden onset of a focal neurological deficit, stroke is the first diagnosis that comes to mind. So we all know that stroke is a form of brain dysfunction and that it occurs when there is obstruction in the blood flow to the brain. So one of the first questions that a clinician or a physician should ask when dealing with a stroke patient is, what caused the brain dysfunction and what pathological processes are active in this patient? So broadly speaking, we all know that there are two major categories of brain damage. First is ischemia. That is when there is a blood clot or a thrombus which blocks or obstructs the flow of blood in a blood vessel, resulting in a lack of blood flow. And thereby the brain tissue is damaged. And the second type of stroke is what we know as a hemorrhagic stroke or an intracerebral hemorrhage. In this, a blood vessel ruptures or bursts and the blood leaks out into the brain parenchyma. And again, the blood flow gets interrupted to the brain. Now, although both are completely contrary mechanisms, but in both cases, the brain is deprived of oxygen. And thereby, it results in either a localized or a generalized type of injury. And many biochemical substances are released along with this, which results in subsequent swelling and pressure and injury to the brain. So we will first discuss about ischemia in detail and the different mechanisms that can cause ischemia, and then we will go on to hemorrhage. Now, ischemia itself can occur due to different underlying mechanisms, and they can be classified into thrombosis. So thrombosis is when there is obstruction of blood flow due to a localized occlusive process within one or more blood vessels. What it means is that some processes within the blood vessel of the brain itself are occurring, which results in the formation of a clot, which ultimately obstructs the blood flow and results in ischemia. In contrast, embolism, which is the second mode of ischemia, is when the clot or the material is formed elsewhere. For example, it is formed in the heart, and from there it travels and comes and blocks the blood vessel in the brain. And this process where the clot is formed elsewhere and comes and blocks another blood vessel elsewhere that is in the brain is known as an embolism. And lastly, sometimes when the overall systemic pressure or the blood pressure of the body drops very low, it can result in decreased blood flow to the whole brain. And that also can result in an ischemic process and ultimately infarction. We will further discuss these mechanisms in detail. So if you, like we said, thrombosis, that is obstruction of blood flow due to a localized occlusive process. So if you look at this figure, this is how a blood vessel looks like in cut section. This gray area in the center is the lumen, and the area around it is the arterial or the vessel wall, right? So this is the lumen. So what happens is plaques can develop within the vessel over time. So this white area that we see is the plaque formation. So naturally, when the plaque formation is occurring, this lumen, which is the gray area, is getting occluded. And then more and more, what happens is fibrin and platelets and other materials can come and collect over this plaque, and it can result in a complete occlusion of the blood vessel. So this is how the complete occlusion of a blood vessel looks like, and this can result in subsequent loss of blood flow subsequent to the artery, resulting in an ischemia and an infarction. And this is how patient will present with an infarct. Now, atherosclerosis is the most common pathology behind thrombosis. If you look at this figure, again, what we saw initially, there is plaque formation, then white platelets and fibrin will come and collect over it, and the entire lumen will get occluded, resulting in a complete infarction of the brain, which is being supplied by that vessel. This is a necropsy specimen of the internal carotid artery, where the lumen of, this is the cut section, the lumen of the blood vessel was completely occluded by this blood clot, and ultimately resulted in infarction of the patient. Now, in contrast to thrombosis, we said embolism is when the material is formed elsewhere within the vascular system, and then a piece of it can break off from that material or the thrombus, and it lodges and blocks a blood flow in another vessel. So this is not caused due to a localized process within the blood vessel, but due to a clot that breaks from somewhere else. For example, if there is a clot which is originating in the heart, and from there a small piece of it breaks and it travels and it comes and blocks a vessel in the brain, this is what an embolic process looks like. So the most common source of the embolism is mostly from the heart. It arises proximally, and other areas such as other arteries such as the aorta, carotid and vertebral arteries can also result in an embolic process. So this is how it is. This was the donor site from where a small emboli broke off, and it went and traveled elsewhere to the recipient site and blocked the area, and resulting in a subsequent infarction of that area. And the last mechanism that we discussed is decreased systemic perfusion. So sometimes if the generalized blood pressure or the systemic pressure of the body is decreased, it can result in a diminished flow to the brain tissue. It's like a pipe or a pump with a low pressure. So you can imagine if there is a pipe which has a high pressure, the water will flow to a larger area. But if the pressure of that pipe, the pressure of the water in the pipe becomes less, then the area that it will be able to supply will be less. So that's exactly what happens in decreased systemic perfusion, and it results in a generalized affectation of the brain. That means it is not one particular artery, but multiple areas of the brain, especially where the perfusion is not adequate, where the blood supply is not adequate. Those areas are the first ones to get affected, and it can result in multiple areas of the brain getting infarcted. So this is how the infarction would look like. It is not just in one particular area or one arterial territory, but multiple areas of the brain, a diffused injury that can occur in this kind of phenomena. Now, just to explain all the three mechanisms, you can take an analogy to a simple plumbing situation. So this is how, this is a kitchen sink and this is the tap. If the water in the tap does not flow freely. So multiple reasons could explain that. It could be a localized process within the tap itself. It could be some material or debris which is collected within the tap itself, and that is resulting in decreased water supplying from the tap. So that is akin to what we see in a thrombosis. If, let us say, in the tank there is some material which is getting collected or some debris which is collected in the tank, and from there a little bit of debris travels and lodges itself in the pipe somewhere, that is similar to what happens in an embolic process. And lastly, if the pressure in the tank itself is very low, then naturally the water will not be able to come up till the tank. And then the plumber, if he comes and corrects the tap or the pipes here, it will not solve the situation. It is the main problem of the tank water. The pressure of the tank is not sufficient, and that is why the water is not coming. So this is similar to what we see in a decreased systemic perfusion pressure. So coming back to our patient, after she reached the emergency room, an NCCT head was done, and it showed a right-sided, this is the right side of the brain, a right-sided hypodense area, which is suggestive of an infarct or an ischemic process. On the other hand, if this area had been white, that would have shown hemorrhage. So there is no evidence of any hemorrhage which is seen over here. That means this patient had an ischemic stroke. As to whether this was due to a thrombotic, embolic, or some other cause can only be deduced after doing further investigations like imaging of the blood vessels, angiography, etc. Now, once there is an occlusion in the blood vessels, what all pathophysiological processes occur in the brain that result in ischemia? So as soon as the blood supply is obstructed, the brain cells start dying due to lack of oxygen. This occurs at a very, very rapid speed. In 1 minute, almost 2 million neurons or brain cells are dying. That means that the area of ischemia keeps enlarging depending upon the time from onset of stroke. So the centralmost area, which is supplied, centralmost part of the brain, which is supplied by the artery, is the first area to start dying. And this area is known as the core area, what we see over here. And the area surrounding it in blue is the penumbra. That means this is an area of reversible damage. So if the patient gets treatment on time, and if the blood supply of the brain is restored fast enough, then we can salvage this area, which is the blue area, and the green area, which is known as the oligemic zone. These are areas of decreased blood supply, but not absent blood supply. So that means if we timely correct it and there is reperfusion, we can salvage all of this area and we limit it with a very small core. But if the patient does not reach on time and we're not able to reperfuse on time, so this whole area becomes bigger. So the core becomes a very large core. The whole area of penumbra is also lost. So the purpose, while dealing with any patient with stroke as physicians, is to salvage this area of penumbra. That is why we say time is brain. Now, what happens at the micro level, at the pathophysiology, at the microscopic level, what is happening in an ischemic stroke? So after seconds to minutes of cerebral ischemia, the ischemic cascade gets initiated. This is a series of biochemical reactions in the brain and other aerobic tissues, and it usually goes on for 2 to 3 hours, but can last for days also. And even after the normal blood flow returns. So what happens is the brain cells, there is not adequate oxygen, so the brain cells start dying, and they lose their ability to produce ATP, which is the source of all energy. So when there is no ATP, they go into an anaerobic form of producing energy. And but unfortunately, because of that, there is also lactic acid, which is produced as a byproduct. And that can subsequently result in a lot of neuronal damage. Apart from this mechanism, lactic acid is also an irritant. So this also further has the potential to destroy brain cells. In addition, the biochemical system and the pumps in the brain, the usual neuronal pumps in the brain become dysfunctional. And there is a lot of influx of unwanted chemicals and ions like calcium and potassium. All of them, the balance between all these ions is lost. So a lot of calcium comes inside, a lot of potassium is lost from the brain, and this further activates another series of arachidonic acids and free acids and free radicals which are generated, and all of them in conjunction with each other result in further and further neuronal damage. And as in how the neuronal damage keeps on happening, more and more the blood-brain barrier is broken down, and this further damages kills the brain cells, and there is a lot of subsequent edema which is developed, and there is a swelling around the area of injury, and this further causes what is known as secondary progression or injury. So these processes usually last around 3 to 5 days, sometimes even more after the initial insult, which is to say that at the point of insult, when you see a patient, he or she may not have so much edema as soon as the stroke occurs, but in the subsequent next 3 to 5 days are very critical, because there is associated swelling and edema, which usually occurs with the stroke, and it results in worsening and more instability in the patient. In comparison, when there is an intracerebral hemorrhage, the blood vessels ruptures and there is direct bleeding into the brain parenchyma. So this is the pathophysiology of injury after ICH. What happens after intracerebral hemorrhages, that is when the blood vessel breaks and blood leaks into the brain. There occurs two types of injuries. One is the primary injury, which is also known as the primary white matter injury, and the secondary injury. So the primary injury, the immediate that occurs is because of the mass effect. Because of the blood which is released into the brain, there is a mass effect because of the hematoma, and there are secondary pathological changes that occur from the hemorrhage. And although ICH is commonly considered a single event disease, it is now more recently being considered as a dynamic condition with multiple phases. And then occurs what is known as the secondary injury. So there is after the acute ICH, and there is an increase in the mass effect. There is blood which is extravasating into the brain, and it causes a mass effect, and there is pressure, and there's compression and disruption of the surrounding neuronal tissue. All of this comprises the primary injury, and this is what presents in the patient as the focal neurological deficit. Following this primary event, other pathological events occur, which results in secondary brain injury. There is release of inflammatory cytokines, and there is thrombin which comes and collects, and all of this adds to the oxidative stress and the neurotoxicity, and it further results in edema, swelling, and perihematomal swelling and edema, which is a further complication of the hyperacute phase of ICH. So this is how the pathophysiology of ischemic stroke is different from the pathophysiology of ICH. Now, parenchymal ICH occurs in a localized region. So different types, I'm just showing you the different common sites of ICH. It can occur in the basal ganglia, which is the most common area that occurs. Then the thalamus is another common area that occurs due to secondary to hypertension. A pontine hemorrhage, this is brainstem, this is part of the brainstem, and this is hemorrhage in the pons. Then in the cerebellum, this is the cerebellum, this is the right cerebellum, this is how it looks if there's a bleed in the cerebellum. And sometimes due to secondary to hypertension, even the lobar areas can also have a bleed. Intraventricular hemorrhage is when the blood occurs in the ventricles. So if you look at here in the ventricles also, there was some hemorrhage which is coming. That is what is known as intraventricular hemorrhage. So coming to the evolution of the cerebral hematoma. So in the hyperacute stage, that is less than 12 hours once the bleeding occurs, there is just production of oxyhemoglobin, the intact red blood cells which contain oxygenated hemoglobin. In the acute stage, which is around 12 to 72 hours of evolution, the red blood cells become desaturated and the oxyhemoglobin converts to deoxyhemoglobin in the acute stage. In the early to subacute stage, which is 3 to 7 days of evolution, there is further changes from deoxyhemoglobin into methemoglobin and so on and so forth. And ultimately in the chronic stage, all of this blood gets converted into hemosiderin. So the blood in the hematoma clots and solidifies, and there is subsequent swelling of the adjacent brain tissues, and later on the blood gets resorbed. So this is how it is on a CT scan, how it looks like, how it progresses from hyperacute to chronic stages. And finally the blood gets absorbed, and after the macrophages, they come and clear the debris. Sometimes there may be a cavity or a slit kind of formation that may disconnect brain pathways. So coming to the most important section of our topic today, why do we need, what are the considerations that we need to take for rehabilitation depending upon the pathophysiology of stroke. So, but what is the rationale for that? Why do we need to tailor our rehabilitation? So post-stroke recovery has been widely studied, but the majority of research has focused only on ischemic stroke. Now that we know, we have understood, now we've looked at the pathophysiological processes, both in ischemic stroke as well as in ICH, we see that the pathophysiological mechanisms are different in the two types of stroke. So understanding that, I think it would be safe to assume that even the processes of recovery would be different between the two stroke subtypes. Now, animal models of ischemic stroke preclinical studies have identified that there is an early sensitive period just after stroke, during which if you provide rehabilitation, it leads to larger improvements. However, all of these studies have predominantly been taken in ischemic stroke. There is lack of evidence for a sensitive period in humans, both for ischemic as well as hemorrhagic stroke. Secondly, we still don't know. So that is why we still don't know whether early rehabilitation is advisable in ICH or not, or if contrary to ischemic stroke, whether ICH patients may continue to improve beyond the so-called sensitive period or not. Secondly, depending upon the hemisphere involved, the clinical implications are different and rehab content may need to be tailored accordingly. And we will discuss this further in the upcoming slides. Thirdly, different pathophysiologies may result in different sites of involvement in the brain. And depending upon the anatomical site of the involvement or the area of the involvement and the type of clinical deficit, also we may need to tailor our rehab. So, dividing it according to stroke subtype, that is ischemic or hemorrhagic. So like I said earlier also, most of the rehab trials include patients with ischemic stroke, with very few rehabilitation studies focusing on patients with ICH. Many of the larger neurorehabilitation trials have included both hemorrhagic and ischemic stroke patients or excluded ICH patients altogether from the study. I'm highlighting two studies over here. The first study, this was a multi-center RCT of 243 patients with ICH. This was conducted in China, and they studied the effects of early rehab in ICH patients only. And they randomized their patients into two groups, that is early rehabilitation less than 48 hours versus standard care, where rehabilitation was provided after 7 days of stroke onset. And it was seen that in the early rehabilitation group, there was decreased length of stay, improved quality of life, increased independence in ADLs, and decreased 6-month mortality. Again, another study, so that is to say that early rehabilitation was found to be beneficial in ICH. Another study that needs to be mentioned is the AVERT trial, a very early rehabilitation trial. This is a recent trial that indicated that very early intensive mobilization may be detrimental after stroke. And this was a large RCT with both ischemic or hemorrhagic stroke patients. And very early mobilization, that is less than 24 hours with more frequent sessions, was found that patients were found to have unfavorable outcomes. And this effect was more strongly seen in patients with both severe stroke as well as ICH. So the outcome being that early rehabilitation in ICH patients is challenging, often because these patients are unstable. They may be in ICUs requiring close neurological and hemodynamic monitoring. And so therefore, we need to take care while addressing these patients, whether the rehabilitation interventions, they should not cause any fluctuations in blood pressure and ICP that can lead to any kind of hematoma expansion or worsened outcomes. Then early recovery in ICH. Now, another point is this to be considered, that majority of the recovery after ICH, it occurs early. This was a recent longitudinal study of patients with ICH that characterized the time course of recovery. And it was seen that sensory, truncal, and lower limb motor impairment improved till 3 months, and thereafter it plateaued after 3 months. However, the upper limb and ambulation continued to show improvement till 6 months. Then another study which looked at motor function, it's in ICH patients, it showed that motor function recovered in all patients, but patients with preserved corticospinal integrity at baseline seem to have greater integrity. So they concluded that it depends upon the integrity of the corticospinal tract. Next, to see whether rehab is more effective in ICH than in ischemia. So when matched for baseline clinical severity, it has been seen that patients with hemorrhagic stroke seem to have more effective outcomes as compared with ischemic stroke. So they looked at in a preclinical study where size and location matched ischemic or hemorrhagic stroke, rodents with ICH seem to have greater recovery of skilled walking ability. Similar results were also seen in ICH human patients who received the same type and dose of inpatient rehabilitation. And again, it was found that the ICH patients showed greater recovery and reduced activity limitation. So further, so there is definitely benefit of early rehabilitation after ICH. However, these mechanisms are incompletely understood, and we need to have further refinement of more neurorehabilitative interventions where the timing, intensity, schedule, and dose can be with focus on these factors so that they can be decided so as to further optimally develop our neurorehabilitation protocols. Now, prolonged recovery in ICH more than ischemia. This is another factor which has been studied. It has been seen that gait, limb, motor, and sensory function, they continue to recover until 3 months. However, gait can improve in up to 6 months also from onset, whereas upper limb recovery may even persist up to 1 year. This was a study that showed that, and this prolonged recovery is a witness to the beneficial outcome of rehabilitation even during the subacute phase of recovery. So it has been postulated that in acute phase as well as in early stages of recovery following an ICH, delayed metabolic changes, continued neuronal damage, and apoptosis in the perihematomal tissue that we spoke about in the pathophysiology, this can continue to cause more active inflammatory damage, which then further is mediated, leading to more widespread consequences. So in comparison with an equivalent ischemic infarct in patients with ICH, there is increased inflammation and greater cell death. However, there is growing evidence that the recovery in these patients, despite that, is much better and more prolonged as compared to ischemia. So another difference to be considered is the stroke subtype and severity. So the Oxfordshire classification of stroke categorizes stroke into 4 subtypes. And as the name suggests, it divides ischemic stroke based on the area and the location of blood supply which is affected. So whether it's a total anterior circulation infarct or a partial anterior circulation infarct or a lacunar infarct, or if it's in the posterior circulation. Now, this classification is a very widely accepted classification. It has been shown to accurately predict the site and size of the lesion in around 3/4 of cases. So a TACI, which is total anterior circulation, is the one with the severest impairment and the disability profile. And these patients are most likely to develop complications, to deteriorate, and to have a significantly worse prognosis. Whereas similar to that, patients with ICH also tend to be very serious in the initial phases, and they can sometimes present with impaired consciousness, and they are second least likely to achieve mobility milestones. In this study, they looked at retrospectively and they found that the TACI patients received less walking, stairs, standing balance, and transfer practice in their physiotherapy sessions, with more time which was spent on passive movements and positioning, which is the type of therapy that is associated with greater impairment and need of help and support. This was similar to what has been seen in previous research, also where TACI patients were the least likely of the subtypes to achieve the 4 physiotherapy mobility milestones. In the present study, patients with POCI were seen to have the highest number of sessions which focused on standing and sitting balance. The study also showed that patients with LACI and POCI were most likely to be independent and achieved most mobility milestones. And in this study, both had active therapy profiles and were more likely to receive sessions of activities of daily living. One study previously has shown that patients with ICH have a high incidence of impaired consciousness, whereas patients with LACI had a high prevalence of weakness. In this study, patients with both ICH and TACI were found to have the least amount of activity. However, in this current study, they found that their cohort of patients with ICH had an active therapy profile, and it was similar to those patients with LACI, in fact, and not with TACI. And this probably could be explained with the low number of patients that were recruited with ICH, and also that the particular cohort of ICH patients that they recruited had a baseline GCS which was more than 10. So this could explain for this observation. It is natural that the high physical demands on staff and numbers, it is obvious now that we see that patients with TACI or ICH or patients who require a lot of support will have high physical demands of the staff and the numbers of staff which is required. While patients with LACI and POCI, there will be more challenges with facilitating and supervising training towards independence. Now, symptoms of stroke can differ depending upon the hemisphere which is involved. While both hemispheres, either of the hemispheres which involved will result in motor and sensory involvement to some extent. there are some major differences in the two hemisphere involvements. Like patients with left hemisphere involvement will have language deficits, aphasia, difficulties in comprehension and speaking. Whereas right hemisphere patients can, involvement of the right hemisphere can result in specific symptoms such as hemi-neglect, apraxias, dressing difficulties, constructional issues, visuospatial issues. So based on that, based on the hemisphere which is involved, we again need to tailor our rehab. So some of the special deficits which we see with right hemispheric stroke are prosopagnosia, which means that there is difficulty in recognizing faces. What happens is there is damage to the fusiform gyrus, which is present in the right hemisphere of the brain. And this is the area which helps you to recognize faces. So when there is damage to this particular area, the patient loses his or her ability to recognize faces. Sometimes they may have difficulty in very severe cases to recognize their own faces as well. So this naturally can result in a lot of difficulty and emotional turmoil for the patients. Left neglect, that means, or hemi-neglect, this means that the patient is unaware of the environment on the left side. So some patients, when they have damage to the right hemisphere, they may lose the ability to pay attention to the left side of the environment. For example, they may not eat food on the left side of the plate. So this is a patient who was asked with the right hemispheric stroke, who was asked to draw a clock. And if you see, he's crammed in all the numbers onto the right side because he suffers from left neglect. He is unaware of the left side of the clock that he has drawn. Then anosognosia, which is neglect or denial of disability. So unfortunately, when you have a right-sided stroke, sometimes they can be in denial of the disability because it has impacted their self-awareness. The patient is unaware of the existence of a disability. This usually occurs when there is damage to the parietal lobe or the frontotemporoparietal area in the right hemisphere. And this is a very serious condition that needs to be addressed because this means that the patient is in denial of his disability and it will prevent them from seeking treatment because they do not even feel that they have a disability to begin with. And lastly, pseudobulbar effect. That means there can be sudden outbursts of emotion, also known as emotional lability. So this can also occur sometimes in right hemispheric strokes where there is uncontrollable outbursts of emotion like laughter or crying. This can occur in a left hemispheric stroke as well. But it is where the emotion is out of proportion to what the situation demands. They may laugh at something which is not funny, or they may even laugh at something which is sad. But this is a neurological condition and the rehabilitation professional should be aware of this and it should not be confused with other psychiatric disorders. So now when you're considering rehabilitation for patients with right-sided stroke, certain additional measures you need to keep in mind. For example, if the patient has a cognitive involvement like prosopagnosia or an object agnosis, then the cognitive assessment and rehabilitation needs to be considered. Speech and language pathologists can help with recovering speech and cognitive function like object recognition. And this can help with conditions like prosopagnosia. A group of SLPs have also come up with the CT Speech and Cognitive Therapy app, which is something that you can use on the phone itself and can help with these cognitive therapy related issues. Then attention. When dealing with patients with hemi-neglect. So this is something that needs to be taken care of. So if a patient has left hemi-neglect, so patient can be instructed to turn the head to the left side to bring awareness and attention to that side of the environment. This is the kind of a compensation technique and it helps the brain, train the brain to pay attention to the left side. Then vision can be an issue that can again happen both in left side also, but if it's a right stroke patient, then vision restoration therapy you need to take care of. And visual tracking exercises can also be given because vision is very essential for a patient to start resuming his daily activities like driving, walking, etc. Then psychotherapies, like some of the side effects of a right side hemisphere involvement can affect the patient's personality, for example, like anosognosia. So you can give some kind of motivational therapy or motivational enhancement therapy, and it can help improve the self-reflection and reduce the patient's resistance to treatment. So comparing right versus left hemisphere stroke, there is conflicting evidence whether which particular hemisphere involvement corroborates with better outcome. And this controversy comes from various factors. It depends upon the outcome scales which have been used to compare the two types of recovery outcomes, the measurement domain which is being used, if there is presence of hemi neglect, and the timing of the evaluation. So with regards to vocational rehabilitation, patients with right hemispheric stroke seem to have a better outcome. And what has been postulated is the preservation of the language function, which only occurs in left hemispheric strokes. And so right hemispheric stroke patients do not have language dysfunction. And this preservation is one of the primary reasons for a large percentage of right afflicted stroke survivors to return to work. However, a lot of social shortcomings may be seen with right hemispheric strokes in comparison to left-sided strokes, and that can act as a shortcoming. However, you need further studies where hemi-neglect patients have been excluded so as to further exemplify this difference. Now, according to anatomical site, depending upon the site of involvement in the brain, clinical deficits may be different. So, for example, if it's a posterior cerebral artery territory stroke, which affects the which supplies the posterior part of the brain and the occipital area. So we know that the occipital area is mainly dealing with visual symptoms. And so these patients with PCA territory strokes can present with visual symptoms like homonymous hemianopia, can have cognitive issues, confusion, agitation, all of these symptoms may be present. So then the rehabilitation, apart from the motor rehabilitation, needs to have a special focus on vision and cognition as well. And then whether any artificial bypass or some kind of a compensatory mechanism using an alternate input channel can be utilized or not. So the rehabilitation professional needs to keep that in mind. Or for example, an ACA territory stroke, the anterior cerebral artery stroke. This will present with more of lower limb deficits as compared to upper limb. And patients may also have confusion, mutism, abulia, where they refuse to talk and refuse to respond to an outside stimulus. So again, the rehabilitation focus should be on gait and lower limb and also on cognitive and speech therapy. Now, a randomized study examining the effects of balance training with electromyogram triggered FES looked at the outcomes, and it showed to improve static balance, dynamic balance, and ankle muscle activation, and showed some positive effects. Now, in this study, they compared ACA stroke with MCA stroke patients over 7 years. They followed up these patients for over 7 years, and it was seen that the ACA group showed better motor and total film scores at discharge, and better outcomes in activities of daily living were seen in the ACA group of patients. We can further categorize our rehabilitation approach based on the clinical deficit that the patient has. For example, if the patient has sensory deficits, which can be commonly seen in patients with involvement of the internal capsule, posterior limb, or the thalamus, can result in sensory deficits. So it has been seen that sensory deficits are associated with increased stroke severity, decreased motor function, and sensory dysfunction is a prognostic factor for treatment outcomes. It has been shown to prolong the duration of hospital stay and also negatively affect the person's ability to use the upper limb. So first of all, we need to assess and evaluate whether the sensory impairment is central or peripheral. So if there is primary sensory modalities are lost, like patient has proprioception difficulties, or his joint position sense is lost, or if he has pain and temperature sensation loss, etc. So those are loss of primary modalities. Or if the patient has more of a cortical involvement with complex sensory impairments such as agraphesthesias, stereognosis, etc., which are more of central sensory mechanisms. So for this, we need to, it requires an additional assistance to relearn all the cognitive and motor skills. Now, what are the barriers to sensory training? Although there is high incidence of sensory impairments post-stroke, but the studies of somatosensory retraining programs are still very limited. And clinicians also pay very little attention to sensory training in stroke rehabilitation. So this was a study by Papa et al. In 2015, and they said that lack of time and resources, limited knowledge, and with the primary focus being on motor recovery, these were the barriers which were reported to sensory training. So, sensory re-education. These are the different types of methods which can be done for sensory training. You can re-educate where the therapist uses an attempt to retrain the sensory pathways or stimulate the unused pathways. And the second method is where you use some compensatory techniques, where the patient is taught to use his vision to observe the motion and location of body parts, where they avoid exposure of the involved limb to any cold or sharp objects. The unaffected side can be used to check the temperature before bathing or washing objects. The unaffected side again will handle sharp objects or adaptive devices such as a one-handed cutting board. Adaptive task objects like built-up handles on the affected side to distribute the pressure, etc. So different types of sensory training are present, and it's broadly divided into active and passive. So active sensory training involves when there is manual exploration of different textures, figures, objects with the hand, and spatial detection of limb position. You touch different textured objects like cotton and pin, and you and sense and feel how the different objects feel. In passive sensory training, this involves the application of electrical stimulation to produce activation of cutaneous nerves in the absence of muscle contraction. And a thermal stimulation is when there is application of a heating or a cooling stimulant. There is some evidence to show that transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation, or TENS, can also be effective as a form of passive sensory training. However, much more evidence is still needed. So these are few meta-analyses in 2009, 2019, and in 2013 by Kita et al., where they showed that TENS has a high degree of clinical utility, is relatively risk-free, and it is easy to implement when combined with active sensory training. Coming to cognitive dysfunction. So among all the factors which have a negative outcome, cognitive dysfunction has been described as the most potent. However, you cannot look at cognitive rehabilitation as a standalone therapy. And there are more benefits for the patient when it is administered as part of a multidisciplinary approach. The interventions are diverse, but it needs to be tailored to the individual needs. And broadly, again, this is divided into restorative and compensatory approaches. In the restorative approaches, you are reinforcing, strengthening, or restoring the impaired skills by making the patient do repeated exercises of standardized cognitive tests. And in compensatory approaches, you enable the patient to bypass or compensate for the impaired function. For example, using of assistive technologies, calendars, reminders, alarms, etc. Attention process training is another program where it's a restorative type of program, where the direct attention training program, and it targets 5 components of attention: focused attention, sustained attention, selective, alternating, and divided attention. So finally, I would like to say that rehabilitation plan has to be tailored according to every patient's distinct needs, and the rehab professionals should be aware of the type, site, location, severity, and clinical deficits associated. And as in how you go along, as in how the recovery process goes forward, the rehabilitation plan will also change. So it has to be a tailored plan. And very importantly, the recovery depends upon a multidisciplinary approach. That means a group of people, a multidisciplinary team of people, which includes the physicians, the rehabilitation nurses, the physical therapists, occupational therapists, speech and language pathologists, the social worker, and the psychologist, all together get together and have a common approach of dealing with the rehabilitation program for the patient. So what are the take-home messages? Stroke can be ischemic or hemorrhagic, and the pathophysiology and mechanisms are different in different types of stroke. Recovery and rehabilitation plan for stroke patients should be tailored according to the type, site and location, and clinical deficit associated with stroke. And finally, multidisciplinary approach to stroke yields best recovery outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for enlightening us with this. I hope genuinely our viewers will be, I would say the way you have explained using the analogy of the tap and the water in the same thing, it has made the thing very easier for our viewers to understand the thing. Uh, Plus, I think, as you had said and summarized the thing, by that while tailoring the rehab protocol for the patient, we need to take into consideration all these factors, like what is the type of stroke, area of affection, site of affection, hemisphere which is involved, what is the anatomical site, what are the deficits and everything. That will definitely help the viewers for that particular thing. But add on, I would say ki even the most common question that we therapists face is the relatives, they are asking ki, what is the expected time duration of recovery, or when will my patient walk, or when he or she would be able to go back to job. These are the common question faced. I hope even all these things will help us answer those questions also, because it is not only one factor which can give the answer to this question, because we need to take care of all the areas, like what is the severity of affection, where is the affection, what is the expected prognosis of the patient. And as said by you, the research studies with respect to ICH are very less. So that is also one area which needs to be tapped on. So I hope overall you have covered the whole thing to help the thing how to tailorize the program for which type, what more needs to be emphasized on.
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nathan. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah.